Hey, what's going on everybody? Bit vs. Andy here, and today I'm going to explain all things about elements and elemental damage in Bit Heroes. Now, I'm not gonna lie, when I first started playing this game, I totally misunderstood elemental damage. I assumed it was something like Pokemon, where, where like water does double damage to fire, that kind of stuff, but it is very, very different in Bit Heroes. So I'll make sure to explain how elements work in Bit Heroes, helping you optimize your damage output and survivability in battles. So, what are the elemental types and what is elemental damage in Bit Heroes? As I pull up the Bit Heroes Wiki here, we can see here all of the elemental types. There's fire, earth, air, electric, water, and then physical or neutral. Now, as you're reading this, you're going to see, okay, fire is weak to water and strong to earth. So my first impression, which is incorrect, is that, okay, if I'm fighting an earth enemy, my fire damage is going to do bonus. However, that is not true. But how it actually works doesn't lie in the damage being dealt. It lies in the resistances. So fire resistance, and I'm going to scroll down to this chart here. Fire resistance here. If I get hit with it by an attack that is fire, the fire resistance will be 100% effective. And all that means is that for every 1% fire resist, I will get 1% damage reduction from a fire attack. If I get hit by a physical attack, for every 1% of fire resistance I have, I will get 0.75% damage reduction from a physical attack. And if I'm hit by a water attack, for every 1% fire resistance, I will get 0% damage reduction. So basically, all of this ring of strong and weak versus different things is water cuts through 100% of fire resistance. Fire cuts through 100% of earth resistance. Now, where you can take advantage of this is, let's say you're facing someone and you know they have a Tetheus. Okay, well, they have 20% water resistance. If I want to cut through that water resistance, I know I can bring electric damage to the table, and they won't be able to have any damage reduction from that bonus. Now, you might be asking, okay, Andy, what about physical? Physical is just 0.75 against everything besides physical. It does not have a weakness. Now, there is no physical damage resistance. It is literally just called damage reduction in the game. And it is super consistent against all the elements, but it is only 75% effective. So if you know you're going to face a physical opponent, damage reduction is best. If you know you're going to face a fire opponent, fire resistance is best, and so on and so on. Now, do note, and I think it'll say it down here, that no matter if you have damage reduction or resistances, the absolute maximum damage that you can reduce is 75% of the incoming damage. And if you are a math head, go ahead and check out these formulas. Basically, it's just saying, okay, the damage reduction or the damage resistance times the effectiveness of that element. Now, if you're curious where to see your resistance in game, you can go ahead and click on your character, come up to the eye, scroll down in your stats, and you can see it right here. We've got fire resistance. I've got 8%, electric resist 0, water resist 0, a bunch of zeros. And then more towards the top is the actual damage reduction, which you can think of as physical resistance, where I've got 5%. So fire attacks, I am most protected from. Not by a lot, 8%, and then 0.75 times 5%. So not a ton of resistance, but it is something. What about elemental damage? Should I get those elemental runes? So for the defensive runes, they can be as good or as bad as damage reduction runes, just depending on what you're getting hit by. But for the elemental damage runes, these offensive ones, plus electric damage, plus water damage, air, earth, and fire, I would call these a little bit of a noob trap, because plus bonus damage without the element actually affects any skill no matter what. So if I pull up the normal runes, you can see major runes. Just this Ogok rune, plus 2.5% damage, will boost a fire skill just as much as this plus 2.5% fire damage rune. So in reality, like, these are definitely not worth getting, because what if you end up switching your elements down the road? You might as well have just gotten the plus damage instead of the plus elemental damage. So I would highly recommend avoiding these plus damage ones. However, the elemental resistance ones is a different story if you need certain elemental damage resistance. Another huge part of Bit Heroes, another huge role of elements in Bit Heroes is status effects, or often referred to as stacks. And just pulling up the wiki here again, I'm a huge Bit Heroes Wiki stan. Love it. Link to the Bit Heroes Wiki in the description, by the way, if you guys want to read this for yourself. But basically, there is stacks in Bit Heroes, and there's a few different types. There's Shock, Combust, Bleed, Freeze, Root, and Corrupt. And each of these is tied to a different element. Shock is electric. Combustion is fire. Bleed, oddly enough, is air. Freeze is water. Root is earth. And Corrupt, actually, funny enough, does not follow a single element, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. So starting off with Shock. Shock applies a stack on the target when it is hit. And once you get 3 stacks on that target, it triggers an EMP that basically hits everybody on their team equal to the amount of damage stacked. So if I hit you with a shock that deals 100 damage, 100 shock, 100 shock, 100 shock, that EMP will hit everybody on the team for 300, basically summing the total there. So it can absolutely bomb enemy teams. Very, very good for AoE. And remember, this is electric damage. So since it's an electric damage, unless they have electric resistance, you are going to be cutting through some of their damage reduction, especially if you're facing someone like Tithius, one of the most popular mythic tanks in the endgame. EMP is going to cut right through his water resist. Very, very useful. And if someone brings physical damage reduction, one of the more common ones people have, their damage reduction is nerfed to only 75% effectiveness. Now that's going to apply to all of these, I guess, besides Corrupt, which is a little bit of a unique one. But next we'll talk about Combust. Now Combustion, same deal, how it applies a stack when you hit them. And upon receiving the 3rd stack again, the target explodes himself and receives damage equal to the amount stacked. Very, very similar, however, it only applies to one enemy. Now you might be thinking, oh my gosh, that just makes Shock so much better if it hits the whole enemy team. Now, in theory, that's right, but Combust skills usually hit harder. So basically, if I combust someone for 200, stack 200 combust, 200 combust, 200 combust, and then at the end, the explosion comes out and they get hit for a total of 600. So combustion is very, very strong. And remember that it does fire damage. So very strong against earth resistance users. So bleed, similarly, when you apply it, it adds stacks, but you can go up to 4 stacks of bleed. And it caps at 4. So versus earlier when you had combust or shock, if you applied 100 stacks of combust in a turn somehow, they would all apply and there would be, 33 explosions. But if you apply 100 stacks of bleed, it will only max out at 4. So keep that in mind if you have crazy, crazy high speed. Because how bleed works is you stack the bleed on them, and then when it comes to the start of their turn, before they have a chance to do anything, that bleed will do damage to them. And it will last for 4 turns. Now note that bleed does the air damage. So as we look at the chart here, air, this will be very effective against electric resistance users. One thing that I personally love about bleed is that you don't have to get 3 or 4 stacks for it to do something. You just, as soon as you get one stack off, as soon as their turn comes up, it is hitting them. So it is very, very reliable and useful. Super consistent. Next up, we have Freeze. Now, Freeze does water damage, and you can apply stacks on a target. And this one, you have to get up to 4 stacks. So more than Combust and Shock, you have to get the 4th stack for it to do anything. And basically, once you hit that 4th stack, your enemy is frozen. They do not take bonus damage, but their next turn is skipped. Okay? Now, you can't perma-freeze anybody. They do gain immunity to freeze until they take at least 1 action normally. So you can, if you are fast enough, you can freeze your enemy so much that they skip every other turn, cutting their effectiveness in battle in half. So it can be super, super strong, especially against enemies that hit hard. Imagine they just hit you half as much. Very, very good defensive ability here. Or if you're shutting down an enemy healer, you could see this as offensive too. Reduce the amount they heal is just like dealing damage. So very, very useful with Freeze. Now, really quick, while we're on the topic of Freeze being offensive as well, I do want to call out there is familiars as well as sets that players can get that give you what's called Shatter. And basically, if that familiar or you with a Shatter set hits someone who is frozen, it basically turns it into very similar to Combust, where it does bonus damage. So there is ways to shatter frozen targets and make it totally offensive. Now, Freeze is water damage, so it can cut right through fire resistance users. Moving on, next up we have Root. So Root also can have a maximum of 4 stacks, similar to Bleed. How, even if you applied 100 Root stacks, only 4 would stay. Root reduces the damage from that target minus 3% for each stack. So if you have that max of 4 stacks, they will have a minus 12% damage bonus, basically, just negative damage bonus. So if they were hitting you for 100 damage after 4 stacks, okay, now they're only hitting you for 88 damage. And each Root stack also lasts for 4 turns, very similar to Bleed. There is some sets that, similar to Shatter and Freeze, make rooted enemies take bonus damage, or once you hit 4 stacks on a rooted enemy, they take basically similar to Combust and Explosion and stuff like that. So there's some sets and stuff that can tweak it into very offensive, but fundamentally, Root just kind of saves your team from getting hit as hard, which can be a lifesaver. Now, Root does earth damage, so it can be a very good way to cut through someone with air resistance. And then the final stack, not tied to any of the elements, but it is called Corrupt, and we'll take a look here. As you hit an enemy with Corrupt, it will reduce their highest resistance by 5%. So if you have, 10% fire resist and 30% water resistance, this will take off 5% of your water resistance up to 3 times. And it will last, until the battle is over. So basically, whether they have physical damage reduction or one of the elemental resistances as their highest, you can knock it down by 15% after 3 corrupt stacks. So it can be very useful for dealing with someone with, really high resistance or damage reduction, and really helps your entire team deal damage. So in the right situation, this can, almost boost your damage by 15%, which is very, very nice. Now, a couple more things listed here in the wiki that are definitely worth chatting about is that stacks can be cleansed, okay? If I just pull up cleanse here, there's a lot of support sets or, various skills, whatnot, that will remove stacks from the target, okay? So if you have 2 stacks of Combust on you, or 2 stacks of Combust on your tank, and you cleanse them, boom, they're back to 0. Now the enemy has to get 3 Combusts on you again instead of just being 1 away. So cleanse can be a great way to counter stack users. If they can never get that 3rd shock or combust off, or that 4th freeze, then you're avoiding a ton of damage or avoiding freezes. You know, there's a ton of benefits to cleansing this stuff off of your team. That is pretty much all of the basic information about elements and all of their stacks in Bit Heroes. As for putting this into practice and how you can modify your build, if you are going up in PvP and you notice you're facing a lot of Tetheuses, or Tethei maybe. I think it's Tethei. He's kind of, you know, he's got tentacles. He's like an octopus. But if you're facing a lot of Tetheus, you know, he's kind of a meta tank. You know, it's very likely in PvP you're going to face water resistance. You might want to consider bringing electric damage to cut through that. Vice versa, if you see a lot of people using Lurky, which I don't have yet, I'm working on him. But you'll notice in his abilities, he deals electric damage, okay? You might want to consider building electric resistance. So electric resistance would be the choice if you're facing a lot of Lurkies. And now besides Lurky and Tetheus, I think those are the two most meta familiars, the ones we run into the absolute most. There's a ton of physical familiars as well. One of my favorite familiars, Glarzdos. If we pull him up, all of his skills deal normal damage. So if you're trying to counter Glarzdos, you know, I know he's a bait tank. He's not going to be damaging you so much. But if you're running into a lot of Glarzoses, you could consider stacking normal damage reduction. And if you notice you're facing Glarzoses and you want to cut through their damage reduction, use anything besides a physical attack or a neutral attack. Every element will be stronger than a physical attack against Glarzdos because his damage reduction, or basically physical damage resistance, will only be 75% effective against elemental attacks. So it can get pretty complicated, especially when enemy teams have mixes of different elemental resistances and damages. But at least now you understand, you know, how to get around those resistances or how to yourself resist some of those elemental damages. So at the end of the day, there is no one size fits all. There's going to be a situation where every single elemental resistance is best for you to have. So I would encourage you guys, you know, when you get into battles, especially difficult, hard to win battles, click on the enemy, see what they're doing. You can see here, Rida deals air damage, okay? I might want to consider tweaking my team to have a little bit more air resistance, especially if I have something like electric resistance. If my tank is relying on electric resistance, his air damage is getting through it completely. So you got to watch out for those elemental matchups. Basically, every battle is going to be unique, and you might have to actually strategize what you bring elemental-wise to beat certain content. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, Andy, I don't ever want to have 0% effectiveness. I'm just going to go all physical to keep it simple. You know, I would, at that point, unless you're facing only physical damage users, at that point, I would just recommend going with something like evade or block or deflect or absorb, because elemental damage can still be evaded, deflected, blocked, absorbed. Those are 100% effective 100% of the time, versus damage reduction can be only 75% effective, or any of the elemental resistances can be as low as 0% effective against certain enemies. Another super important tip about stacks that is not actually even written down here is that stacks can be evaded, but they cannot be damage reduced. So what I'm trying to say here is, if you are a damage reduction tank, or you have a damage reduction tank and you're getting hit by Combust, even if you have full fire resist, the Combust stack is still going to stack, and after 3 stacks come through, it will blow up. However, if you are an evade tank, every time you evade is one time that they don't get a stack put on you. So it is important to understand that damage reduction is pound for pound worse against elemental damage and any enemies that can put stacks on you. Now, this applies to evade, deflect, and absorb, but not block and damage reduction. If you block or have damage reduction or damage resistances, any of the elements, you will still be affected by the stacks. So depending on the enemy, honestly, if they are like a combustion legend, you might want to consider, oh my gosh, okay, well, should I go fire resist or should I go evade or something? Fire resist is going to be more consistent. There's never going to be a full damage hit that comes through, but you will still get hit by those combusts. So, there's definitely pros and cons to each, and I'd recommend you testing out which one works best for you and your team. That's going to be pretty much all for this one, guys. Please let me know if you have any questions about elements. I'll be answering questions down in the comments. I do want to take a quick second to give a huge shout out to all of my current channel members, as well as my current stream boss. Thank you, Persuade You, for supporting on stream. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope you guys learned something about elements. And until next time, take care and good luck with your grind.